Hi, this is Marina again. Welcome back to reading Mountains Beyond Mountains with me. Last time we did chapter 3. Today we're going to start with chapter 4 and continuing to find out what Dr. Farmer does as a public health physician in Haiti. Soon after I arrived to visit him in Canje, Farmer said he'd be my Virgil here. I think that when it came to Haiti, he viewed almost everyone as a potential source for education, not re-education. No other country in the world has been subjected to such idiotic commentary, he said, and it would have been hard to argue the point. Given the fact that, for instance, the name of Haiti's indigenous religion has long since become the synonym for crazy ideas and sheer luridness. Farmer liked to tell a story about his own education in Haiti, a story about the relation between medicine and the beliefs in sorcery. In 1988, a woman from Zemi-La-Sante's catchment area had died from tuberculosis when he was in Boston, recovered from a badly broken leg. When he returned to Canje, several of the staff told him that the woman wouldn't have died if he had been on hand. They meant this as a compliment. He converted it to self-reproach. He wanted a medical system that functioned in his absence. He gave everyone in the woman's family jobs at Zemi-La-Sante and called a series of staff meetings to figure out what was wrong with their system for treating TB. The staff had a lively debate. Zemi-La-Sante's community health workers, who lived among the peasant farmers, who had been, until recently, mostly pleasant farmers themselves, spoke about the economic impediments to treatment, pointing out that the poorest patients tend to fare worst, certainly in part of malnutrition. One health worker recited a Haitian saying, giving people medicine for TB and not giving them food is like washing your hands and then drying them in the dirt. But most of the Haitian professionals on the staff, the doctors, the nurses, the technicians, offered explanations that laid the blame in the minds of the patients, the kinds of explanations that often reads on scholarly journals. Once they felt better, but long before they were cured, patients stopped taking their pills, the professional said. And the patients did this because they didn't believe TB came from microbes, but believed it was sent to them by enemies via sorcery. Farmer felt intellectually torn. The health worker's theory amounted to a description of the kind of socio-economic arrangement that he called structural violence. But he was also an anthropologist in training, schooled in the importance of the kinds of cultural beliefs that the professionals cited. So he designed a study. He was still a student at Harvard. The study was like a class he created and then attended as a pupil. He selected two groups of TB patients. During the study, each group got free treatment, the same they would have received at the Brigham. But one group got other services as well, including regular visits from community health workers and small monthly cash stipends for food and childcare and transportation to Canje. Farmer hiked to the many villages of the patients, visiting all of them in their huts. This took weeks. 100 chatty Haitians, he would say, don't try this at home. He asked all of them, among other questions, if they believed that TB came from sorcery. And all but very few in the group said they did. And yet when the results came in, the cure rate for the two groups were dramatically different. Of the patients who received only free medicine, a mere 48% were cured. By contrast, everyone in the group that received the cash stipend and other services made a full recovery. Whether a patient believed that TB came from germs or sorcery didn't seem to have made any difference at all. Farmer felt puzzled. I expected to buy into the idea that what's in the people's minds affect their behavior and outcomes, he told me, and he was at a loss for explanations. until he began re-interviewing the patients and called on one of his favorites, a sweet, rather elderly woman. When he had first interviewed her about a year before, she had taken mild offense at his questions about sorcery. She had been one of the few to deny that she believed in it. Polo Cherry, she had said, I am not stupid. I know tuberculosis comes from people coughing germs. She had taken all her medicines. She had been cured. But now, a year later, when asked about sorcery again, she said, of course she believed in it. I know who sent me my sickness, and I'm gonna get her back, she told him. But if you believe that, he cried, why did you take your medicines? She looked at him. He remembered a small, sympathetic smile. The smile, he thought, of an elder explaining something to a child. In fact, he was only 29. Cherry, she says, the Creole phrase pas simple means not simple and implies that a thing is frightened with complexity, usually of a magical sort. So in free translation, she said to Farmer, Honey, are you incapable of complexity? And then, of course, it dawned on him that he knew plenty of Americans, he was one of them, who held apparently contradictory beliefs, such as faith in both medicine and prayer. He felt, he said, as though he hung in the air before his patient, suspended by her sympathy and bemusement. The study was for him a command to worry more about his patients' material circumstances than about their beliefs. From then on, all TB patients in the catchment area received the full package of service. Each continued to get what is called directly observed therapy, a community health worker on hand to be sure the patient took the medicine on schedule, and each got the monthly cash stipend, the equivalent about $5 to pay for extra food, childcare, and transportation to a monthly doctor's visit at Zami Lasante. The program had worked well. Indeed, couldn't have worked better. They hadn't lost a single patient in 12 years, and Farmer wasn't about to change any of the rules. Just recently, a TB patient from a village called Moore Michael hadn't shown up for his monthly doctor's visit. So, this was one of the rules. Someone has to go and find him. The annals of international health contain many stories of adequately financed projects that failed because non-compliant patients didn't take all of their medicines. Farmer said, the only non-compliant people are physicians. If the patient doesn't get better, it is your fault. Fix it. A favorite Dr. Paul story in the village of K. Eppen was of the time, many years back, when Farmer had chased a man into a field of cane, calling to him plaintively to come out and let him treat him. He still went after patients occasionally, to inspire the staff, he said, and to give him a break from his office. So he was going to mourn Michael himself and was taking me with him. Wow, this is so surprising that a doctor would go chasing after his patients to make sure that they're taking their treatments. It just shows that how responsible he is and how much of a perfectionist he is. Like, he would not let anyone give up on their disease. It is similar to this doctor I read about in the book Better, which I also recorded videos on that you can check out. There's a cystic fibrosis program, and the doctors there they use all sorts of methods to make sure that their patients are doing all of the treatments and not getting infections and stuff. Beyond mountains, there are mountains. The proverb appeared to describe the location of Morne Michael, the most distant of all the settlements in Sami Lasante's catchment area. At breakfast on the appointed day, Farmer told the woman in the kitchen his intentions. Ooh, they cried. One said, More Michael, Polo, do you want to kill your Blan? She meant me, of course. She wasn't being rude. The woman in the kitchen even called Farmer a Blan. Usually they'd call him T Blan, Muen, meaning my little white guy. But a Blan isn't necessarily white-skinned, one might say. Even Blan becomes white by virtue of being a Blan. The African American medical student Farmer had brought here some months back, for instance. Some people at Demi Lasante had wondered if he was Farmer's brother, and later some had mistaken another visiting Black American student of Farmer's as the first one. And when Farmer teased them about this, one of the staff had said, Farmer swore this was true. All you Bland look alike. Farmer drove the first leg in the pickup truck, south down National Highway 3, past two-roomed huts with metal roofs and little granary on stilts, built, he explained, to keep food safe from animals. But rats still ate about a third of the harvest, and stunted-looking pigs and goats and scrawny yellow dogs. Smiling for a moment, he said that Haitian peasants had a lot of sayings, that they are the only farmers with land so steep that they break their legs in the cornfield, that their dogs are so skinny that they have to lean against a tree in order to bark. Soon a reservoir came into view, a mountain lake far below the road. The scene looked beautiful, blue waters set among steep, arid mountainsides. And if you saw with peasant eyes, Farmer said, the scene looked violent and ugly, a lake that had buried the good farmland and ravaged the highlands. He parked beside the ruin of a small cement factory. Plants were growing helter-skelter high up the rusted structure. 100 yards away stood a concrete buttress dam. These days, when he wasn't in Haiti, he gave a lot of speeches, sometimes several in one day, and in every one I heard, he talked about the dam. It appeared in all the books he published by 2000, and in the books that he had helped to write and edit, and also in many of his journal articles, 42 of those by them. As a scholar and writer, Farmer had taken his greatest pain to assert the interconnectedness of the rich and poor parts of the world, and the dam was his favorite case study. It stops up Haiti's largest river, the Artibonite. It is called the Peligre Dam, and the impounded waters behind it, the Lac de Peligre. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had planned it. Brown and Roots of Texas, among others, built the structure in mid-1950s during the reign of one of Haiti's American-supported dictators with money from the U.S. Export-Import Bank. It was advertised as a development project, and no doubt some people behind its creation believed it a gift to Haiti. But no one seems to have given much thought to the peasant farmers who lived in the valley upstream. The project was intended to improve irrigation and to generate power. It wasn't as though the peasants of the Central Plateau didn't need or want modern technology, Farmer said, but as they themselves often remarked, they didn't even get electricity or water for their land. Most didn't get money either. In fact, the dam was meant to benefit agribusiness downstream, mostly American-owned back then, and also to supply electricity to Port-au-Prince, especially to the homes of the numerically tiny, wealthy Haitian elite, and to foreign-owned assembly plants. Since the flooding of the valley, many peasant girls and boys from Cange, children of what Farmer called the water refugees had left home looking for work in the capital, where they cooked and cleaned and stitched Mickey Mouse dolls and baseballs, more than a few of them nowadays returning home with AIDS. When Farmer first saw this piece of Haiti and began to ferret out its history, old-timers talked longingly to him about the days before the water rose, when families lived on farms beside the river, and everyone had enough to eat and some left over to sell. Some remembered being warned that their land is going to be submerged, but the river had always flowed by, and they'd examined the dam in progress, and they couldn't believe that a mere wall of concrete could hold back the river. One of the old people of Cange remembered seeing the water rising, and suddenly realizing that his house and goats would be under water in a matter of hours. So I picked up a child and a goat and started up the hillside. Families had hurried away, carrying whatever they could save from their former lives, turning back now and then to watch the water drown their gardens and rise up the trunks of their mango trees. For most, there was nothing to do but settle in the steep surrounding hills, where farming meant erosion and widespread malnutrition, tending near every year toward famine. And for years there were wailings and curses and loud arguments among old neighbors, fighting over titles to the land that was left. Things got worse. Even after the dam, most peasants still had their black, low-slung Creole pigs, which they kept like bank accounts, to pay for things such as school tuition. But in the early 1980s, they lost those as well. Alarmed about an outbreak of African swine fever in the Dominican Republic, afraid that it might threaten the American pork industry, the United States led an effort to destroy all the Creole pigs in Haiti. The plan was to replace them with pigs purchased from Iowa farmers, but these were much more delicate, much more expensive to feed and house, and they didn't thrive. Many peasants ended up with no pigs at all. When school started the year after the slaughter, enrollment had declined dramatically throughout the country and around Cange. Wow, this part is kind of sad to read, that foreign intervention has done a lot of bad things in terms of Haitian economy, and people used to live pretty well, it seemed, but after building a dam that benefited certain people, a lot of Haitians now are left to be very poor and have no properties and such. So it's no wonder that they don't have good health care, because they can't even have enough money to feed themselves, and it's not entirely their fault. We walked across the top of the dam. The railings were rusted, the concrete flaking. To our right, the roiled waters of the Artibonite rushed away, and to our left, a few small canoe-like vessels piled blue, placid waters. It looked almost like a tropic desert resort. Farmer walked briskly along. A small juvenile escort followed him for a time. Local people heading the other way smiled when they saw him and said, "Bonjour, Dr. Nguyen." "Good morning, my doctor." There were clouds, then sun, then clouds again, and a gentle breeze. I felt vigorous and cheered by the borrowed popularity. On the other side of the dam, a footpath, loose dirt and stones, went straight up. Farmer had a slipped disc from 18 years of traveling Highway 3. His left leg had been surgically repaired after he had been hit by a car back in 1988. And turned out at a slight angle, like a kickstand, one of his brothers said. He had congenital high blood pressure and mild asthma, which developed after he had recovered from a possible case of tuberculosis. But when I got to the top of that hill, sweating and panting, he was sitting on a rock, writing a letter to an old friend, a contributor to Partners in Health, whose spouse had recently died. This was the first of many hills. We passed smiling children climbing steep rocky paths that I had to clamber up on all fours. They were carrying water in pails and plastic jugs that once held things like paint, oil, and antifreeze. The full containers must have weighed half as much as the children did, and the children had no shoes. We passed beside many patches of millet, the national staple, which seemed to be growing out of rocks, not soil, and small stands of banana trees, and now and then other tropical species. Farmer pausing to apply the Latin and familiar names: pawpaw, soursop, mango, a gloomy litany because there were so many fewer of each variety than there should have been. On a fair number of the trees that remained on those hills, and also on rocks, I saw political graffiti, usually scrawled in red paint, TT'd, and the number 2001. These were, respectively, the nickname of former President Aristide and the year in which, judging from all of the posters and graffiti I had seen around Cage, he would be elected. Politics, I suppose, was one of them. One means by which Haitian farmers avoided hopelessness. Many AIDS experts from prosperous places gladly expressed hopelessness on the Haitians' behalf. Farmer would say, "By this point of our hike, I was too guilty. The houses we passed in the mountains were much worse than most of the ones around Cage. They had dirt floors and roofs made of banana fronds, which, Farmer pointed out, leaked during the rainy season, turning the floors to mud. We passed a group of women who were washing clothes in the rivulet of a gully. "It's Saturday," said Farmer. "Washing day. I guess the Maytag repairman didn't come." "Haitians," he said, "are a fastidious people." "I know. I have been in all their nooks and crannies. But they blow their noses into dresses because they don't have tissues, wipe their asses with leaves, and have to apologize to their children for not having enough to eat." "Misery," I said, but this would not suffice. He was on a roll. "And don't think they don't know it," he said. "There is a WL line, the they're poor but they're happy line. They have to do nice smiles and a good source of humor, but that's entirely different." Like many of his remarks, this one gave me a pulse. Just when you thought you had the hang of his worldview, he'd surprise you. He had problems with groups that on the surface would have seemed like allies, and often were allies, in fact, with, for example, what he called WLs, white liberals, some of whose most influential spokespersons were black and prosperous. "I love WLs, love them to death. They're on our side," he had told me some days ago, defining the term. "But WLs think all the world's problems can be fixed without any cost to themselves. We don't believe that. There is a lot to be said for sacrifice, remorse, and even pity. It's what separates us from the roaches." We walked on. I noticed, as I had around Cage, that many people we passed wore clothes from America, brand-name running shoes that have seen much better days, and baseball caps and T-shirts bearing the logos of professional sports teams on country clubs. Kennedy's was the generic name for stuff like that. Back in 1960s, Farmer had explained, President Kennedy sponsored a program that sent machine oil, among other things, to Haiti. The Haitians tried to use the oil for other purposes, such as cooking, and concluded that the gift was of inferior quality. Ever since, the president's names have been synonymous here with the second-hand and shoddy goods. Now and then one saw another kind of import, meant strictly for adornment. There was a young worker at Zami Lasante who wore a new-looking Haitian-style straw hat on which he and his wife had sewn a homemade cloth that read Nike. Okay, this is pretty funny, but also I've heard that the Americans send a lot of our secondhand clothes to people in other countries, and that they think that it's helping them, but actually it hurts their local clothing industry. So it seems a little sad to hear that the Haitians have to utilize stuff that Americans don't want because they can't afford to have anything. We went on, deeper and deeper into the mountains, Farmer leading the way. We chatted front to back. I was drenched in sweat. I couldn't see even signs of perspiration on his neck, his pencil neck, as friends of his called it. Many people waved to him, the lifted hand motionless, the fingers fluctuant, like the legs of insects on their back. Do you see how Haitians wave? Don't you love it? He said to me, waving back with his fingers. The trail wound across barren, steeply folded mountainsides. I had thought that I was fairly fit, but at the top of every hill, Farmer would be waiting for me, smiling and making excuses for me when I apologized. I was 14 years older. I wasn't used to the climate. The one-way trip to Montmichael usually took him 2 hours. About 3 hours after we'd set out, we arrived at the hut of the non-compliant patient, another shack made of rough-sawn palm wood with a roof of banana fronds and a cooking fire of the kind Haitians call 3 rocks. Wow, it just shows how dedicated Dr. Farmer is. He spends several hours to reach this one patient who didn't come for his treatment, and he has to climb so many mountains. I can't climb one mountain. Like if I went on this trip, I would just I would just crash. Farmer asked the patient, a young man, if he disliked his TB medicine. Are you kidding? He replied. I wouldn't be here without them. It turned out that he'd been given confusing instructions the last time that he was in Cage. And he hadn't received the standard cash stipend. He hadn't missed any doses of his TB drugs, however. Good news for Farmer. Mission accomplished. He had made sure that the patient's cure wasn't being interrupted. We started back. I slipped and slid down the paths behind Farmer. Some people would argue that this isn't worth a 5-hour walk, he said over his shoulder, but you can never invest too much in making sure this stuff works. Sure, I said, but some people would say, how can you expect others to replicate what you're doing here? What would be your answer to that? He turned back and, smiling sweetly, said, F you. Then, in a stentorian voice, he corrected himself. No, I would say, the objective is to inculcate in the doctors and nurses the spirit to dedicate themselves to the patients, and especially to having an outcome-oriented view of TB. He was grinning, his face alight. He looked very young just then. In other words, F you. We started on again, Farmer saying over his shoulder, and if it takes 5-hour treks or giving patients milk or nail clippers or raisins, radios, watches, then do it. We can spend $68,000 per TB patient in New York City. But if you start giving watches or radios to patients here, suddenly the International Health Committee jumps on you for creating non-sustainable projects. If a patient says, I really need a Bible or nail clippers, well, for God's sake. This part is actually kind of fun to read because even though giving patients money to and other incentives to receive TB treatment seems quote unquote and not sustainable, but like if you look at America where you're spending so much more money and not getting as good of an outcome, then you might start to wonder, well, why isn't our treatment as efficient as those administered in Haiti? I was scrambling down yet another steep incline when from a chorus below I heard a commotion, yelling, then a little dull, then yells again. In a few minutes a cockfighting pit came into view, a corral entirely surrounded, several people deep, by men in straw hats and ragged pants and shirts, shod in torn sneakers, flip-flops, old brown dress shoes without laces. On the periphery there were a pair of competing food sellers and a couple of men who had set up games of Zo. It involved a board and a thing that looked like a Victorian teapot for shaking dice. There were also women at the edges of the crowd. A place was made for Farmer at the railing. He watched for a moment. The cocks were circling each other. Then one made a charge, wings flapping, and Farmer turned away. He moved to the edge of the trees, when suddenly a couple of chairs materialized, metal chairs with torn seats, one red, one blue. This always happened in the countryside when I was with Farmer. The appearance of chairs, one for Dr. Paul, one for his Bland. We said. In a moment we were surrounded by women, a dozen or more, elderly-looking women, lovely young women in sundresses and one torn shoulder strap. A middle-aged woman with a beautiful face but several front teeth missing, leaned against a tree and spoke softly to Farmer. The others stood by other trees or sat in the dirt close by, some speaking to him too, from time to time. One woman was telling him that they needed an additional community health worker up here, but mostly they were just passing the time. Is there a more widespread notion that than the one that rural people are laconic, and there is a rural place anywhere in the world whose people really are? I was worn out, my clothes completely drenched. My thoughts were wandering. I thought of the chairs we sat on, discarded. I imagined, during the refurbishing of an office in Minneapolis or Miami, and about their long journey here. I imagined I knew why the women were doing this, ignoring the national sport on a Saturday to gather around Farmer and chat with such mild desultoriness. Voices low and musical and unhurried. Some years ago, he had added to his growing medical program a health project for just women and, lacking a gynecologist on the staff, had made his own quick study for the specialty and for a time practiced it here. He had probably given a number of these women the first pelvic exams they had ever received, and had talked to them about birth control, offering it if they wanted. The shouts and cries from the cockpit seemed to be reaching a crescendo, but they sounded far away. I felt as if I could fall asleep, and as if I really had, enfolded in femininity. The rest of the way back was mostly a decent but descent, but there was also some slopes to climb. I straggled up out of another ravine and, as usual, found Farmer waiting for me. He stood at the edge of a cliff, gazing out. I walked over to him. The view from where he stood was immense. Screams of rain and clouds and swaths of sunlight swept across the yellow mountains in front of us, and the yellow mountains beyond those mountains, and over the Lac de Pellegris. The scene, I realized, would have looked picturesque to me before today. So maybe I'd learned something, not enough to suit Farmer, I suspected. Education wasn't what he wanted to perform on the world, me included. He was after transformation. I offered him a slight moist candy, a lifesaver from my pocket. He took it, said, "Pineapple," which, as you know it, is my favorite, and then went back to gazing. He was staring out at the impounded waters of the Artibonite. They stretched off to the east and west and out of sight among the mountains. From here the amount of land the dam had drowned seemed vast. Still gazing, Farmer said, "To understand Russia, to understand Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Boston, identity politics, Sri Lanka, and lifesavers, you have to be on top of this hill." The list was clearly jocular. So was his tone of voice. But I had the feeling he had said something important. I thought I got it. Generally, this view of drowned farmland, the result of a dam that had made his patients some of the poorest of the poor, was a lens on the world. His lens. Look through it and you'd begin to see all the world's impoverished in their billions, and many linked causes to their misery. In any case, he seemed to think I knew exactly what he meant, and I realized, with some irritation, that I didn't dare say anything just then, for fear of disappointing him. The final part of this chapter gave me like a very meditative and philosophical moment of a doctor sitting on top of the mountain and contemplating of the world and how some people are suffering and how he could help them. So I really enjoyed this chapter, and I hope you did as well. Thanks for being with me, and I'll see you next time.